Good afternoon. Welcome to UW TelePain. I'm Jim Robinson, filling in for David Taubin today, and we're going to have a presentation by Greg Carter, and then we do have one case that's going to be presented by Susie Rapp. So, to jump into the talk, this is Greg Carter speaking on medical marijuana, and Greg, take over.
Thank you, Jim, and I appreciate you guys being able to adapt to my vacation schedule. So today's talk is update on medicinal cannabis, and you all have the slides. There's a lot of information here, so I'll try to hit the highlights. There's probably been more regulatory change in Washington State than necessarily change in the science. So next slide, please. So a little background information that most of you probably already know, but before 1937, cannabis-based medicines were widely prescribed by physicians in the United States. And I don't want to get too far into the history here, but it was taken off the U.S. Pharmacopoeia in 1937 officially, or like 1940. But before that, there were commercially available cannabis-based medicines made by Eli Lilly, Park Davis, Sharp Dome, among others. And they came in tinctures, pills, and liniments. Next slide, please. There's a picture of one. Next slide, please. So what really, I think, was a game changer for the medical use of cannabis was the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. Again, this is probably a review for most of you, but we now have identified at least two receptor systems and probably more. The CB1 receptors are in the central nervous system. The CB2 receptors are in the peripheral nervous system, immune system, bones, joints, cardiac system, gut. There actually are, cannabinoids are now known to bind to some orphan receptors that are not that well characterized now. And there is cross-binding actually with flavonoids, which are natural food product found in things like dark chocolate. So flavonoids have weak cannabinoid binding receptor capacity. So this is an emerging area. I think it's really exciting. But the CB1 and CB2 receptor systems have been reasonably well characterized. They're G-coupled protein-based receptors. They're not that unique. They're helical structures, transmembrane structures, not that different from the mu receptors structurally per se. Next slide, please. So there's a little bit more on the endocannabinoid system. We know that our own internal production of cannabinoids, and andamonide is one big one, helps control pain, appetite, mood, sleep, gut motility, muscle coordination, short-term memory. One thing that's of interest to me, and as a neuromuscular guy, is inflammatory levels. A lot of chronic and even some rapidly progressive neuromuscular disorders like ALS, for example, are associated with a high degree of inflammatory processes going on in the cells, leading to apoptosis and that kind of stuff. So I think that's also very applicable maybe in the future to diseases like rheumatoid arthritis as a potentially disease-modifying effect. So activation of the endocannabinoid system involves macrophages, neutrophils, B and T cells, and actually in the periphery, the CB2 receptors help regulate migration of B cells, so they do help maintain a homeostasis in our immune system. Next slide, please. So in terms of medical cannabis, you may hear the term botanical cannabis. That just refers to the plant variety. There's three main species of the plant: sativa, indica, and ruderalis. Ruderalis has no real medical use. And by the way, hemp is a branch off of sativa, which does not produce any measurable THC. So the plants grow a little differently. Sativa is a larger, more branchy plant. Indica is more short and squat, compactly branched. The reason I bring this up is just to let you know that when people say cannabis, even medical cannabis, that's not one thing. It's far from one thing. In fact, as most of you know, there are a bunch of different varieties now. They've been crossbred. And honestly, I don't know that you could even get a pure sativa or pure indica, even though I hear people reference that because they've been crossbred so much in an attempt to get specific medicinal and, frankly, even recreational characteristics. Next slide, please. So natural versus compounded. Of course, as providers, we can write for THC or Marinol. That's a Schedule III drug. It's 100% pure THC. I'm sure you all know that. I hardly ever write for Marinol. It's a fairly powerful sedative hypnotic. It is a good appetite stimulant, and it helps with nausea in people with cancer and chemo-related nausea and vomiting. But it's a very powerful sedative hypnotic, particularly in older people. You got to use it pretty cautiously. Most forms of natural cannabis, particularly if they're grown for medicinal use, have a fairly low THC content, maybe even as low as 3 to 5%, but are higher in some of the other non-psychoactive but equally therapeutic cannabinoids, including cannabidiol and cannabinol. We'll go over that in a second. Point being, though, that a good medicinal strain of cannabis should be very little psychoactivity. There are scientists in Israel that have grown cannabis plants now that have no THC but have higher amounts of the other cannabinoids. And how effective that will be medicinally remains to be seen, but just letting you know that. Next slide, please. So there's kind of a list of the major cannabinoids besides THC. THC was discovered in 1963 by Dr. Mechoulam, who's actually over in Israel. He's still doing research. I think he's in his 90s. And then it was, for many, many years, it was thought that THC was the active ingredient in cannabis. And then in the mid-1980s, Dr. Alessandro Carlini, a Brazilian scientist, characterized CBD and some of the binding properties and actually medicinal properties of CBD. And actually, I am collaborating on some research with his daughter, Bia Carlini, who's at UW. So cannabidiol, you've all heard of that. That's non-psychoactive but has analgesic properties. And here's something to think about, too. These other cannabinoids seem to moderate the effects of THC. So remember I said Marinol is a fairly powerful sedative hypnotic. Marinol, or THC by itself, I think is somewhat of a bad actor. There's a great paper called Taming THC by Ethan Russo, who's a big name in this field. And it talks about how THC is kind of an unruly child when left to itself. So these other cannabinoids that are in the natural cornucopia of the plant help moderate the effects of THC and probably increase its therapeutic efficacy. Cannabinol, CBN, is an anticonvulsant. There's actually at least 80 to 100 cannabinoids, and that is also a sort of a moving target and expanding field. The point here, though, is that these other non-psychoactive cannabinoids theoretically are non-intoxicating and could have very good beneficial effects. Next slide, please. So in terms of the clinical pharmacology of cannabis and cannabinoids, it's actually not complicated. It's not that different from a lot of other drugs. It's plasma protein bound, has a first-pass metabolism through the liver, and 11-hydroxy-THC is now showing up more and more in field testing for intoxication. So if you have THC can linger around in the body for a long time. If you have actively taken in THC, then theoretically you'd have higher amounts of 11-hydroxy-THC indicating recent first-pass metabolism. And of course, you all know elimination is very slow, and the old wives' tale about flunking a drug test 30 days after use is true. In fact, there's a couple of studies came out recently showing that in super heavy chronic users, recreational users, who abstain for like 30 days or even 60 days, I think, they can still pick up trace amounts of THC. It's really dependent on how much body fat you have. And actually, in terms of drug testing, that sort of works against women because they have a little more body fat, so they're more likely to show up positive even after a long time from last use. It does go through in breast milk, and it's a category C. Next slide, please. Here's some clinical pearls. I think cannabinoids are reasonably safe with provider supervision. I have stayed tried and true on that. I think cannabis has great therapeutic potential, but it does need to be used, in my opinion, under the supervision of an experienced clinician. There's no LD50, no overdose. It's generally well tolerated. We'll talk about clinical trials here briefly. No constipation, no respiratory suppression, so it really separates out from the opiates. It relieves pain. It seems to work synergistically with opiates. There's kind of an emerging literature on that area. It works separately and distinctly from opiates. There's no crossover with mu receptor binding, but it does seem to have some synergy with opiates. It improves appetite. In my opinion, it decreases the needs for opioids, and that's been one of the things I think is really useful, and then, again, works synergistically with opioids. Next slide, please. So, history of human research. So, in a nutshell, I've gotten asked this question in meetings and such. You really cannot compare the clinical trials of botanical cannabis to industry-sponsored trials. It's apples and oranges. So currently, and this may change because Obama just liberalized things a little bit. So again, like what I say, there's a lot of regulatory changes going on right now. But historically, if you wanted to do research with medical marijuana, medical cannabis in the United States, you had to get a grant through NIDA, and that's National Institute of Drug Abuse. The grants would run like $500,000. You had to obtain the cannabis from Mississippi, which is where the federal cannabis is grown. It's compared to what people use on the streets per se, it's considered very low quality cannabis. Good news is it's low THC, but I don't even know if they know what the other amounts of cannabinoids are. And hold on a second. I apologize, my screen just went blank. Do you still see my slides up there?
We got the history of human research. Greg.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, I think it was my stupid computer timed out or something. I'm sorry. Well, that was distracting. My screen just went blank. Okay, anyhow, so federal trials are difficult. You guys probably already know all that. Not as much money. You can't compare them to industry-based studies, which are multi-center, millions of dollars, large N. Next slide, please. This is a great study done by Donald Abrams, a hem-onc guy down in UC San Francisco. He really he does an AIDS doctor, basically. This is probably one of the best studies done, even though it was done 8 years ago. He looked at response to HIV, painful sensory neuropathy, and I've used this slide before. It's, I think, the most impressive thing. If you look over to the right, the last cigarette smoked, and this was federally supplied cannabis, I forgot to say that, so it comes pre-rolled in cigarettes, so you have to smoke it, even though I don't recommend smoking. But even after they used the last cigarette, the study subjects had pain relief lasting for about a week after that, compared to the placebo, which is the top line. So yeah, they did have placebo cigarettes, so like pop-flavored cigarettes, I guess, but they had no active ingredient. Next slide, please. So you guys have my slides. I've tried to do a little literature review for you. These are all Class 1 human clinical trials. Next slide, please. There's some more for you. Don't really have time to go through each of these individually, but I gave you the complete reference. They're all on Medline. Next slide, please. And there are some Cochrane reviews coming out. I think these are some of the better ones done recently. Next slide, please. This is a really good trial. Came out in 2011 that looked at 18 trials and included looked at 20 trials, included 18 method criteria. 15 of those 18 showed a significant analgesic effect of cannabis. This was for pain specifically, chronic non-cancer pain. No serious adverse events and only a few withdrawals from the study, and the overall evidence supported the use of cannabis as a safe and effective treatment for chronic non-cancer pain. Next slide, please. And this is very recent, just came out in JAMA, also a evidence-based literature review. They looked at 12 trials that included 1,600 patients, and this is a quote right out of the paper. Several of these trials had positive results suggesting that marijuana or cannabinoids may be efficacious for these indications. I think the authors of, there's a second reference here too, the authors of these papers did their best to sort of hedge their bets. I've actually tried to publish a few of my papers on cannabis in JAMA, and they wouldn't even send them out for review. So it's historically been a journal that's very not in favor of publishing cannabis-based papers. Next slide, please. Same JAMA, same year. I think same authors, too. Actually, this is specifically for medical use. The other reference was for pain. So in a nutshell, they felt the evidence supported its use for nausea, vomiting, reduction in pain, reduction in spasticity. Common adverse events are listed there, and we'll go over those in a second, too, and those are all real. I agree with all that. Next slide, please. So how would this work in real life? We'll talk about how you might approach this in your clinic if you choose to do this. Next slide, please. So no one should smoke anything, in my opinion. The human lungs are not meant to clear smoke. We've had a lot of smoke over here in Spokane recently, so I feel like my lungs have kind of been working double time. You can vaporize the cannabinoids at about 300 degrees Fahrenheit. They basically boil and they go into a mist or vapor. It's basically an e-cigarette, so people are doing that with nicotine now. Nicotine is poison, though, so vaporized nicotine will still kill you. And then so you don't have to smoke. They can vaporize. The advantage of vaporization is you get a rapid onset of effect, so it makes dosing a little easier. Of course, you can also use oral ingestion and topical liniments. So you start out dosing with very low doses. If you're going to have the patient vaporized, then I would say take 2 to 3 inhalations, wait 10 minutes, see what the effects are. Now, here's a little clinical caveat. If you have somebody taking fairly large amounts of opiates, they may take 2 to 3 inhalations and feel nothing, and they may take a half a dozen inhalations and feel nothing. Relatively speaking, the clinical effects of cannabis are fairly mild compared to some of the stronger opiates. And frankly, if you're in a hospice setting and somebody has end-stage cancer pain, you're still going to have to go to drugs like morphine and methadone. You're not going to be able to treat like really hardcore cancer pain with just cannabis, in my opinion. Another clinical caveat, you do not need to be high to get pain relief. That's very important. You need to counsel your patients on that, and when you're dose titrating, have them stop short. So hopefully they'll get a clinical response before they get intoxicated. Next slide, please. There's a picture of a fairly inexpensive vaporizer. It has a little thermistor on it to control the temperature. The one over there on the left is the base unit of the Volcano, which is kind of a famous one, but that's like $500. The one on the right, I think, is $100 about, and it works just as well. Next slide, please. I think I've already covered how the vaporizers work, and it's the same thing as essential oils. If you're doing jasmine, lavender, there's a lot of natural oils in the plant world that will do the same thing. And some patients actually will mix some other natural oils in. I don't necessarily recommend that because I'm not an expert in natural oils per se, but I've had patients tell me they do that. Next slide, please. So again, dosing, start low, go slow, 2 to 3 inhalations, don't need to be high to get pain relief. You can use oral ingestion. That gets a little trickier to dose because you got to know what's in what they're ingesting. And then you can have a 1 to 2 hour lag time, maybe even a little bit longer if they have a belly full of food. Cannabinoids do work well as a liniment, and there were commercially available liniments back, in the 1920s because they're oil-based compounds and they go through the skin fairly well. There are no current injectable forms. Next slide, please. So side effects, yes, there are side effects. They're all listed here. You need to educate your patient on these. Disinhibition, relaxation, drowsiness, euphoria, sensory perceptual changes. I'm sure you guys know all this. It can impair motor coordination. It can definitely impair performance on complex motor tasks, so it can impair driving. Next slide, please. Slowed reaction time. So when I'm authorizing someone to use cannabis, I basically do the same drills I do for opiates, which we all know thanks to the UW Echo Pain thing. So just follow that same risk stratification and identify all these side effects, monitor function, and pain relief, just like you would if you were putting somebody on opiates. Next slide, please. So the adverse effects, particularly, and I would say historically speaking, maybe 40% of my patients actually had never used cannabis, even back in the day, quote. So that's a little trickier. You really got to educate them. Some people are a little bit scared. And I will tell you, I think if you have, say, like a 75-year-old guy with chronic degenerative arthritis, getting high on cannabis is not going to be a pleasant experience for that person. So you really don't want that, because then they're going to come back to you and say, that didn't feel good and I was disoriented and dizzy, blah, blah, blah. So you want to try to hit that sweet spot where you're getting pain relief and not the intoxication. The good news is if they get intoxicated, you just have them sit down and ride it out. 3 to 4 hours, they'll be back on planet Earth. Next slide, please. So here's some clinical pearls. Make sure you screen the patients, do all the things that Dr. Robinson and crew are telling us to do. I think you should just approach it just like you would any other controlled substance. However, I do think the risks and benefits are in favor of cannabis, if you ask me, compared to opiates. Next slide, please. So that's a little bit more what I was leading into. There's not that many drug-drug interactions. It does decrease the bioavailability of methadone, but overall the side effects are mild, low toxicity, no LD50. And then cannabis also has other potential benefits: anti-inflammatory, neuroprotection, anti-tumor properties, which you don't really get with opiates. Opiates are very strong analgesics, but you don't get all these side perks. And I think you can use cannabis as a leverage to keep your patients on lower amounts of opiates. So if they're really pushing you to go to a higher dose of opiates, say, well, I'm not willing to do that, but you could try medicinal cannabis. So that kind of gives you some buy-off that, yeah, you're trying to help them, but you're not really willing to go higher on the opiates. Next slide, please. So cannabis is not for everyone. Some people can't tolerate it, may have allergies, or may not work. Oh, sorry. Bear with me here. My computer seems to be timing out. Bear with me here. Okay, I'm back on. There is a risk for psychological addiction. That's for real. And again, if you do your risk stratification, hopefully you could weed out people, no pun intended, that might be at higher risk for psychological addiction. There is minimal physical dependence, so the withdrawal is mainly psychological, irritability, and depression. Long-term heavy users will develop tolerance. I think you see that more in recreational users. Also that syndrome of nausea and vomiting, which is relieved by showers. That type of stuff you really shouldn't see in the medical population, because you shouldn't really be having them use massive doses as some of the chronic recreational users do. There's still some stigma associated with it. And that's kind of a changing target, too, with the recreational law, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's not a panacea, and it's not for everyone. Next slide, please. So here's some things that it works for. It's not a cure-all, but I think it works very well, and I think the literature would support that it works well for chronic pain, particularly neuropathic pain. Things like chronic muscular pain, myofascial pain, fibromyalgia. It can help with the sleep disorder often associated with pain. I think some people on chronic opiates lose their appetite. They kind of waste away. It can help with that. They get dysthymia from chronic opiate use, and I think cannabis can help with that. Plus, you get all those side perks of the anti-inflammatory. And people with Crohn's disease, where you don't really want to give opiates because it might bind them up worse, make their constipation worse, but they have a lot of abdominal pain, cannabis is ideal. And there's CB2 receptors in the gut. Next slide, please. So, Clinical Pearl, if you do choose to recommend medical cannabis, make sure you go to the DOH website and familiarize yourself with the law. Do proper counseling, risk stratification, and then advise your patient to obtain cannabis that is lower in THC, higher in some of the non-psychoactive cannabinoids like CBD and CBN, and then use a delivery system that maximizes benefits and minimizes side effects. That would be vaporization, oral ingestion, or topical application. You do not have to smoke cannabis. I mean, some patients will just say, well, that's the only way it works. That's baloney. There's no science to support that. Smoking cannabis does not cause cancer, but it can cause reactive airway disease, bronchitis, and all that stuff. And again, our bodies aren't designed to smoke anything. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end here briefly, and there's just too much to go through. That's why I put it all on the slides so you guys can read it on your own. But we did have the recreational law pass, and for the record, I voted against that because I felt that it would potentially screw things up for the medical patients, and I think that's somewhat being bore out. Everything got pulled under the Washington State Liquor. It used to be alcohol and tobacco and firearms, but now they created the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. I just don't like cannabis being regulated by the same people that are regulating liquor. I think that really pushes it into the recreational realm. You can read through these on your own, but it's sort of, I think it puts the medical marijuana patients kind of at risk, and they sort of get pushed to the back. I think we all knew that was going to happen because there's a lot of money to be made with recreational marijuana, and so all of a sudden the person with ALS or some other disability sort of gets pushed to the curb. Next slide, please. There are some good things about the changes in the law. I'm all for standardization and regulation and getting rid of some of those dock-in-the-box clinics where people got like 100 authorizations a day. Those things are all good. Next slide, please. They added post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury to the qualifying conditions. I think that's a good thing. There's new forms for authorization. You need to go to the DOH and get those forms, and they need to be done on tamper-resistant paper, and I think that's good. And I think having providers do legitimate evaluations and treat it like real medicine, that's good. If you write more than 30 authorizations in a month, you have to report that to the DOH. I suppose that's good. Next slide. And this was, I think, this first bullet point was probably aimed at getting rid of the sort of dock-in-the-box pot clinics, which I think is a good thing. There have been changes in who can grow, how much they can grow, where you can grow it. That is what it is. I really like the fact that they got rid of the butane extraction stuff because, in my mind, butane and medicine are polar opposites, and I think butane could potentially lead to disaster. That's an explosive compound. So the things I kind of don't like are, the medical marijuana is now sort of blended in with the retail stores that really, I think, target recreational use because they're going to make a lot more money there. That's the problem. Next slide, please. So also, patients get entered into a database. I don't know if that's good or bad. Next slide, please. They sort of motivate you to do the database. If you're entered in the database, you can actually purchase more cannabis for medical uses. So if you choose not to be in that, then you're left with hanging out there a little bit more. Next slide, please. And this is just sort of showing how they're regulating the cooperatives and the growing. You have to be licensed. You have to get licensed to grow now. They've gotten rid of the old collective gardens. Next slide, please. And then finally, you guys probably already knew this, but the old law, 69.51a, did not legalize the medical use of marijuana. It just allowed for a medical defense. And that's the case law right there at the end. So that's the lecture. Again, I think if you are authorizing people to use medicinal cannabis, you should read through those last slides in some detail. And by the way, those are taken right off the DOH site. The other thing is you can just go to the DOH site, but that's the language that's in the new law. So there have been considerable regulatory changes. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. And we do have some questions. Can you read the questions yourself, Greg, and then read them to the rest of us, or can you see them? We got two from Deborah Dahms.
Okay, let's see.
Do you see those, or you want me to read them?
Okay, I think I see one from Peter Lewis.
Wow.
Oh, actually.
Okay.
Is that coming up?
You got a different set.
He's on Adobe Connect, so he's seeing him before Randy gets in the office.
Okay, well, why don't you read it, Greg? Nobody else can see it.
Okay, so the first question, Dr. Lewis, is are the reviewed published studies using commercial or federal cannabis? They are using federal cannabis grown in Mississippi, about 3% THC, and it's delivered in cigarettes. So not optimal, but and now that may change because Obama just passed some legislation that just happened like a couple of days ago that may open that up. And I feel like really the cannabinoids need to be rescheduled to Schedule 2 because then it would get some interest from industry. Right now, cannabinoids, cannabis, all forms except for Marinol are in Schedule 1. All forms of botanical cannabis, let me restate that. All forms of botanical cannabis are Schedule 1, so the industry is not going to have anything to do with it.
Greg, I've got a question about quality of product, because I've talked to a couple of people at medical marijuana stores, and when you ask them, well, where do your products come from, they begin to kind of look around and not give a clear answer. And, when they say there are certain percentages of THC and such, are these actually made by chemists in a laboratory as you would get a prescription medication made in a laboratory?
That's a great question. There are labs now. Analytical 360 was one of the first ones, but there are several commercial laboratories in Washington State now that analyze cannabis. It's not that hard because the different cannabinoids have different molecular weights. They can be split out on electrophoretic field or gas chromatography. So it's not that hard to separate out the different cannabinoids. I think there's certainly less regulation than like a pharmaceutical company. And again, if cannabis was rescheduled to Schedule 2, you could have compounding pharmacists enter into the equation, and you could get highly quantifiable and reproducible formulations. And again, remember, these things were made back in the 1920s. I don't know what the technology was back then, but there have been, in the United States, there have been commercially available forms of cannabis, cannabinoid-based medicine, I should say.
We've got another question here. I don't know that you can see it, Greg. It says, would cannabinoids suffice as an alternative to benzodiazepines or modulate benzotaper insomnia?
That's a great question. Well, my personal opinion is that benzodiazepines are like one of the worst categories of medicines to prescribe because people never seem to be able to get off of them. I don't think there's any literature necessarily on that, but I would certainly encourage someone to try that. It might help with the insomnia. I think people tapering off of benzos have insomnia and dysthymia, and I think cannabis could help with that. That'd be a great study. I mean, that's one of the things that could be studied.